Hello and welcome back to Warcraft Daily for today the 25th of February 2014. So today's news is rather interesting. First of all, we have an interview with Ian Hosacoasts. Again, Ian has been rolled around all the various websites, and this time it is, I believe, GameZone.de. Yes, videogamezone.de, a German website. So we have that interview, and then a little bit of a note about Ashran and old school Alterac Valley from lore. Overall, lots of interesting stuff today. So first of all, let's get into that interview. So, on the topic of dungeons and scenarios and that kind of thing, he said that the Mists of Pandaria heroics were too easy for most players, which was somewhat necessary due to not having normal difficulty dungeons at level 90. He said that Warlords is going to fix that, because there's, of course, going to be both normal and heroic dungeons at level 100, meaning that there's an additional tier of gear progression before you reach heroics, meaning the heroics can be balanced for a higher level of gear, so they should be a little bit harder. Which is, in my opinion, very, very good, because, well, if there's actually some proper challenging gameplay in there, then I think a lot more people are going to get a lot more longevity out of the dungeons that they launch with. So that's good. Then next he said the normal dungeons are probably going to be roughly the same difficulty as the Mists of Pandaria normals. And yeah, I mean, that's fair enough. Mists of Pandaria, or not Mists of Pandaria normals, sorry, Mists of Pandaria heroics. Mists of Pandaria heroics were basically normal modes rebadged as heroics anyway. So I think this actually makes complete sense. So, yep, good stuff. Okay, so next he said that the Raid Finder mode is going to be balanced around players having gear from normal difficulty dungeons. Now, this is rather interesting, actually, because they're not flat out saying that Raid Finder is going to be a tourist mode, but I'm pretty sure that it's going to be very much removed from the main gear progression. I do remember seeing a tweet from one of the developers a while ago who basically said that they don't want Raid Finder to be a part of the gear progression for the majority of people who just want to do their endgame raiding, their normals, or even their flex dungeons. What should ideally happen, or sorry, not normal or flex, normal or heroic, because of the way they're changing up the names of the different difficulty levels. But ideally, what they want is you just jump from heroic dungeons right into raids. So the heroic dungeons should be a little bit more hard, but then also they have one or two more ways to get gear, and one of those ways, actually, is challenge modes. He said that there's going to be a challenge mode daily quest in Warlords of Draenor, which is going to give you a piece of epic gear that is about on par or better than Raid Finder loot. And this option should actually be open before Raid Finder itself is open, and this would be awarded to anyone who completes the dungeon, meaning that there is no time requirement. I guess this is definitely the closest to a mythic dungeon that we could get, and, well, I mean, it basically is a mythic dungeon. I don't think there'll be any, new loot tables in any of the bosses, so it's not full-on mythic dungeon, but it's basically a challenge mode that has a baseline reward for completing it, so it's a harder heroic, which is fair enough. Now, the one time where people may have a bit of a problem with this is it does kind of, the difficulty of the challenge mode dungeon itself will be removed from your gear progressions. That's probably one of the fundamental differences, but I mean, yeah, it's a nice move, actually. It's giving us more options, and it means that you can definitely get progression via a harder means that still involves a 5-person team, which is very nice. And the next thing he said is that gear progression will likely use normal difficulty dungeons for Raid Finder and then heroic for normal difficulty raids, which I had already said, but that's what Ian himself said, so hey, now we all know. Okay, so the next thing he said is that Warlords of Draenor leveling is going to make use of some solo scenarios at the end of a zone, similar to what we saw in the Isle of Thunder. Now, I'm not sure what I think about this, actually, because I didn't like solo scenarios, because it was basically taking a bit of story and just kind of lumping it off into a separate thing through a load screen and all that. It would be, let's just say, the Argent Crusade stuff in Icecrown Citadel, where you found their base and you push forward. It would be like if they put all of that in a scenario. I'm just not particularly convinced that they can pull it off in a way that just doesn't take away from the pace of what you're doing. I think ideally what they would, so the best way of using this would be to put you into the solo scenario, you do a bunch of things, and then when you come back from that solo scenario, you are in a different phase, which reflects all of the actions that you have done within the solo scenario. I think that would be the best way to do it. Well, I don't know, hopefully they just managed to make these solo scenarios feel a bit more epic and interesting, because I didn't find the Isle of Thunder ones to be that. I found them actually to be very tedious. So yeah, I'm a little bit worried. That said, based on the other things that I've seen and heard about the Warlords of Draenor leveling, it should be pretty good actually, with the darker tone and that kind of thing. So there, that's the Dungeons and Scenarios. The next thing he talked about was raids. He said that Highmaul is going to be highly non-linear, basically a little bit like Firelands, and it's going to have a really large open door area. Yeah, outdoor area, not open door, that made no sense. Anyway, large outdoor area, a whole bunch of optional bosses, and then it funnels you into the last two. I think that's a great way of doing it. Then he said that Blackrock Foundry is going to have a layout that is rather similar to the second part of Icecrown Citadel. So basically you have 3 wings with 3 different bosses each. And you can complete those wings in whatever order you want, which gains you access to Blackhand after all 3 are complete. I think that's really nice, actually. He then also said that the less linear structures work out better for players, and they also feel better, so that's what they're going to be using going forward. And then he also said that there isn't a separate raid tier for each warlord, and we may see 2 or 3 within the same first tier raid. That's basically just reiterating a point that he had already said with, I think it was an interview with Mammy Twink. That's a French website. Anyway, so that's really all the raid stuff. Overall, I'm very happy with this new initiative of heavily focusing on non-linearity, because it really does offer you that breadth of choice that will keep, well, it'll just, prevent the raids from feeling old, which I think is extremely important. So that's very good. Next, he talked about the beta and that kind of thing. So he said that the team has been very much hard-working since BlizzCon, which is what we'd expect. And they've actually also added a new boss to Highmaul since BlizzCon, so that's all very good. Then he also said that Gul'dan is not the main threat in Warlords of Draenor. And, Gul'dan isn't the main threat, and that Grommash and the Iron Horde are, and Gul'dan might even be an ally against him. However, he also did say, or at least people also did say in BlizzCon, that the Iron Horde, or at least Grommash himself, is not going to be a final boss, and that in fact the final boss will not be an orc, so it'll be interesting to see how that all plays out. And next, he said about talking about the beta, that it is soon, trademark. Well, it's weird, like, I kind of thought that it would come out today, and I guess it still could because of American time and, time zones and stuff. That just would have made sense to me because, well, with 5.4.7 coming out and all the code added, I thought the pre-orders would come up today, and maybe they do the beta at the same time as the pre-orders. Or maybe not. Who the hell knows? I guess maybe beta is perhaps a week or 2 after the pre-orders just to kind of keep their hype going. I guess they could do that. So, yeah, that's the thing. Okay, next he talked about classes and that kind of thing. So he said right now that classes have slightly too many instant cast spells, especially healers, and that these can keep themselves alive without ever having to use a spell with a cast time. Basically, that's a little bit of a problem. There's not as much decision making with an instant spell unless it has an extreme mana penalty. So I think that's definitely a good thing. They should maybe emphasize the cast time spells a little bit more, because the game does feel very homogenized when everything is an instant, because it's very hard to differentiate 2 instant cast spells from each other. Next, he said that melee used to be the masters of damage on the move when compared to ranged, but over time, ranged got more and more abilities that allowed them to do damage on the move, which basically meant that melee didn't have their niche anymore, meaning that melee were, in comparison, perhaps a little bit weak in some regards. They have previously said that they're going to be toning down the damage on the move for basically every ranged class, including hunters, but he said that ranged damage on the move is it's like the hunter's niche, so it's going to be preserved to a greater degree than anyone else will. I think that's fine, and I do miss the days of being a hunter when I would have to stutter step and do all those kind of little skill-based things, like even hell, timing my movements with my auto shots, so that I could still do full damage while still moving. Things like that were really cool, and I guess the skill cap's just a little bit lower in that regard. Though it could be, I guess there's an argument there that stutter stepping it's not really very intuitive gameplay when you sort of think about what an actual hunter or a person with a bow would be doing. I suppose. Anyway, so next he said that many classes are going to be having talents that change depending on their spec. Overall, I think this is pretty good. Well, it can be good and it can be bad. If they pull it off right, then it means that specs can have individual talents which feel really unique to them, but then there's also the issue where I guess there was less choice, but since... Wow, it's weird actually. If, let's just say you're level 100 talents, all 3 of them depended on whatever spec you were using, that essentially gives you 9 talents if you think about it in that regard, which I suppose isn't really a realistic way to think about it, but perhaps it does give a bit more opportunity for unique gameplay that really fits in well with your spec, I guess, maybe, so that's kind of interesting. We'll see how it plays out. Then next he said that when it makes sense in Warlords of Draenor, one spec may only have one talent option, while another spec will have access to another. Almost all of the level 100 talents work in this way, and some of the older talents will also work like this. I'm not specifically sure what this means. I'd be very surprised if he meant that out of your 3 talent choices in a tier, you could only choose one because you were a certain spec. That would not be very nice, because it would take away gameplay choices there, and that'd be very bad. I'm guessing that it's within some talents that have like multiple options. One spec's just gonna be locked down to one thing, but I don't know. I don't know if I'm worried about this or not. So yeah, I think we need further clarification. It's probably not good to jump into conclusions based on an interview like this. So next he said that, for an example, the Mage Bomb talent row could have all 3 bombs consolidate into one talent, which gives the Mage a bomb based, yes, one bomb based in their spec, which frees up 2 more spaces on that row for more talent choices. Fantastic. Sorry, I should have read that beforehand, or at least remembered that I had read it beforehand, because I did. But essentially, yes, so in, let's just say a place like with this 3 Mage Bomb thing, previously, they could have just made it so that your entire level 100 talent tier was just 3 Mage Bomb talents, 1 for each spec. Well, now they're just making it so there's 1 talent, which depends on what spec you are, which means that there is more variety in the different talents that are there, which is an excellent thing. And then finally, he said that there are no plans for brown-skinned orc players at the minute, but the team has definitely heard the interest in sub-races, which I think is very interesting, and I'd love to see some sub-races in the game. Next, on the topic of world bosses, he said that attempts at creating a hard world boss haven't really worked out too well, and that the Sha of Anger was probably the most successful one in Mists of Pandaria because it was accessible, it felt quite epic, and you could see him while leveling. Whereas I guess the other ones were perhaps a little bit too zergy for their liking. I know that the Sha of Anger was quite zergy, but one of its gameplay mechanics, wasn't it that some like Sha would spawn under players or something like that, which meant that it had a mechanic which decently scaled up with the amount of players there in a very tangible way, and I think that definitely worked out quite well for that boss. Yeah, I enjoyed the Sha of Anger actually, and I guess Undasa didn't really work out because they ended up having to nerf it because they just sort of messed up some of just the way that boss was. It was weird. I don't know. I mean, world bosses do feel amazing and epic in principle, but sometimes it's just hard not making them this kind of free kill cakewalk, which is a pity. So next he said that there are going to be 3 different world bosses in patch 6.0. Initially only one of them will be available and it will have high mall quality loot. Then a few weeks later a second one will unlock that drops foundry quality loot. That's the Blackrock Foundry, which is the second raid in the first tier. Then, much later in that tier, a 3rd world boss could unlock, which actually drops some heroic raid quality gear. Now, when he says heroic raid quality gear, you have to remember that that means the equivalent of today's normal mode gear, because they're sort of rejambling all the names for the difficulty levels. Next, he said that if a world boss gives rewards that are better than anything you could get out of a high-end like raid tier, then it diminishes the importance of raid zones, and then if the rewards aren't good, the players will just start raiding the world boss. The players will just start raiding, and then the world boss itself will not be relevant anymore, which is certainly true. And it's a very hard balance to hit. I think it's really okay just giving similar gear to the current raid tier, but just not on an ultra high drop chance. So basically what we've been having at the minute. Okay, so then finally Ian talked a little bit about himself. He just said, yeah, finally, that joining Twitter has been nice, and that it gives him a good communication channel with players, and it's a great way to share information. But he doesn't want to share new information about expansions or anything like that. because he thinks it should come through official sites. Basically, he said that it's great for clearing up things and having a dialogue and talking about feedback and that kind of thing. But of course, they're not going to be announcing the beta or the expansion's release date over Twitter. That would be a little bit strange. Alright, so next we have one final post for the day, and it is from Lore. Basically, he posted about how old Alterac Valley has been something that, like, for him personally, he has a lot of nostalgia for. And as for Alterac Valley itself, he said that it wouldn't really be good if people were to expect a battleground to be from 15 to 20 minutes, and then they ended up getting slammed with one that is a few hours long. So that's why they couldn't really just plug old AV back into the game. He said that Ashran is basically there to fill a void. Well, one of the reasons, it's also there to be an awesome new zone, but one of the things it does is fill that Alterac Valley void. It takes heavy inspiration from the old AV. You can, for an example, just go to the main frontline battle and help there, or you could run off and do various side objectives that will help the main battle. Just think of all the little objectives and things you could do in AV, where you could go and kill the rams to bring back things to the NPC, and that would upgrade stuff and things like that, which is all quite cool. Then he also said that real victory can actually take days, though you will, of course, mainly be rewarded for participating in the battle, because they couldn't expect you to sit there for 6 days straight in your computer, though I wouldn't be surprised if some people did. Okay, so then, they also think that you could probably play Ashran in a way that is similar to the way you played vanilla Alterac Valley. And then when somebody said, well, why don't you just put vanilla AV back into the game but take it off the random dungeon thing, or the random battleground thing, he said that they had actually previously talked about that, but one of the issues is that it would take a lot of work to reintegrate the 9-year-old game files into the game, so they would rather just work on the new stuff. And that is something that makes complete sense to me, because I'm familiar with code and how all that shit works, and maybe if you're not, you won't understand this, but trust me, integrating code is a pain in the arse, and sometimes, honestly, there's times when it would just be easier to write your own method for a piece of code than integrating an old one, because it can just be a pain in the arse. And for a game with a code base of the immense size of World of Warcraft, the 9-year-old stuff would just be completely different, and very much painful to put back in. It would take a lot of dev time. But yeah, I think Ashran right now is that healthy balance. I think it's going to provide a lot of people a lot of gameplay, and personally, it's actually one of the new features that I'm looking forward to the most. I can't wait to see how the thing plays out. Anyway, so that is it for today's show. I hope you enjoyed it. If you want to support the channel, you can check out my Patreon page, then like and subscribe this video, because all those various things help out the channel in its day-to-day running, which is rather good. And yeah, with all that said, thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time.